Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about the why behind tanking. We're going to sit down and we're going to talk about why we do what we do as tanks. Alright guys, we're going to talk about several different things today. First and foremost, getting hit in the face, generating the threat, what does that look like? Taunt swapping with your co-tank, placement of mobs and bosses, the awareness of your healer and your own placement and how that matters when you're tanking. You're in charge of controlling the tempo while you're there within the dungeon. You're essentially the person that's in charge of what gets pulled next and how. And knowing your defensive cooldowns and knowing how to smooth that damage, because it's impossible for you to take 0 damage, so it's your responsibility to make sure that your damage is smooth enough so your healer can keep you alive. Alright guys, first things first, generating threat. A lot of this is going to be class specific, unless you have particular Warcraft logs. There isn't a whole lot of recommendations that I can make other than taunting first, because that'll give you 3 seconds to generate threat. However, in dungeons, again, it will be class specific, and you may have to do something different or change some things around with your talents or the way that you're doing things with your rotation. And again, this cannot really be particularly analyzed without something like Warcraft logs. Alright guys, taunt swaps, and how those simply impact the overall progression of the raid. As a tank, it is your responsibility to be aware of the taunt swap, but it is also your responsibility to position the boss and make sure that there is the least amount of movement possible. Now, why is that? The least amount of movement from a boss allows DPS and healers to position themselves for particular power generations, as well as managing their cooldowns, and if they have their own certain mechanics that they need to manage as a tank, keeping the boss in one spot reliably allows the DPS and healers to understand what their role is, where they're supposed to be standing, and how they're supposed to handle their mechanic. It is your job as a tank to create opportunities for your raid by managing the placement of your raid boss and making sure that you and your co-tank are able to make the placements and the taunt swaps successful and consistently. The next thing we're going to cover is placement of adds within a mythic dungeon or heroic normal dungeon setting. Your responsibility as a tank is to obviously pull the mobs, but let's talk about just the position of the mobs for now. A big thing that you want to be aware of is where those mobs are, and you want them to be as tight and together as possible. Why you want them to be as tight as possible is because you want to create an opportunity where your DPS, your ranged, and your healer have the opportunity to stand behind or away from cleave abilities, but it will also provide you with the opportunity to deal with particular affixes should there be any within a mythic dungeon setting, whether you need to run away, kite, or move the mobs. You have all the mobs in one singular spot, so you may move them together. It also creates the opportunity for your DPS to do the maximum amount of damage within a cleave setting as long as all of the mobs are within one area. The other thing that is incredibly important when you're thinking about where you're going to position these mobs is where the patrols are, where the extra adds are, and where line of sight is on particular mobs, so you can avoid pulling too much or pulling extra should a situation arise, much like the situation you're watching in the background currently. Alright guys, let's take a moment to talk about your position, your healer's position, line of sighting, kiting, and how those are super helpful in dungeons and as well as raids. One big thing I would like to bring up that I feel some tanks are not fairly aware of is using line of sight to your advantage. There's a group of enemies within a room and you can line of sight them around the wall, and some of them are casters. It makes it a lot easier to group them up into this giant ball so your DPS can do cleaves. Just taunt one of the mobs, run around the wall, they should all run to you, tell your healer not to heal you so they can all come to you, and then do your cleave to get threat on it before the DPS gets started, and you'll be able to sit there and hold them for that. Now when we talk about line of sighting and kiting, make sure you're paying attention to where your healer is at all times. If you line of sight your healer and you're pulling mobs too far and your healer can't get to you in time, you will die. That is not your healer's fault, that is your fault. Make sure you're paying attention to where stairs are. Make sure you're paying attention that if you crest the stairs, whether it's going down or going up, your healer knows that you're going to be doing that if the healer is not on either side ready for you to move. Another big thing that I see some tanks do not ask for is make sure that you're communicating with your DPS for slows, stuns, anything like that when you need to kite. On this particular clip, it is necrotic week, I'm gaining stacks, but I also know that these ghouls enrage, and when they enrage, they do a ton of damage. So even though I only have 10 stacks of necrotic, which is about 20% reduced healing, I'm still going to kite because they're going to do a lot of damage, and they're going to put way more stacks on me than I want. So I call out to my DPS, they stun them, I kite, I run, they blow them away, they freeze them, they stun them some more, so by the time they reach me again, they are no longer enraged, and I'm able to get away fine, and I have cooldowns still available for if anything happens again. Another big thing that I hear a lot about is tanks are upset because the DPS may be pulling for them. As a tank, you are in charge of the tempo. If your DPS can handle pulling more, pull more. If your healer can handle healing more, pull more and see what happens. Communicate with your team and let them know what's going on. If a DPS is pulling for you, a lot of times it's either because you're not pulling fast enough, or you're in a pug and the DPS is just you know, bad. One piece of advice that I would give you when pulling and controlling the tempo, make sure that you know who's going where, who's doing what. And by that, I just simply mean if your healer and one of your DPS is dead, don't pull too big if you can't handle it, or don't pull it all and wait. If one of your DPS is gone and you think you can handle the next pull and see what's going on. Obviously, if everybody's dead and you're by yourself, don't pull anything, wait for everybody to come. But like I mentioned earlier, if you feel like you can handle the tempo and you feel like you can go fast enough and you can pull bigger, the DPS and healer can handle it, do it. Take risks, see what happens. People are going to appreciate that much more if you communicate, hey, I think we can handle more, I'm going to pull bigger, than if you're skittish and you kind of hide and you don't know what you're going to do. Alright guys, lastly, the thing that we're going to kind of jump into now is defensive cooldowns. A lot of people know what defensive cooldowns are. But do you know when you're supposed to use them? Do you know how you're supposed to use them? Do you know why you're supposed to use them? There's two different reasons that you should be using a defensive cooldown. One, because you're about to get absolutely destroyed by some type of ability. And two, because there's raid-wide damage going out, and you should probably pop one because your healers are focused on what's going on within the raid. Now, a lot of people are very familiar with the first one, but not a lot of people are very familiar with the second one. Paying attention to what's going on within your raid, as well as what's going on with you, can help keep you alive much longer. One big thing that I did want to point out is a lot of tanks feel that they should be absolutely impervious to damage. That is 100% not the case. The idea is that you're meant to smooth the damage so that a healer can get to you and heal you. Rule of thumb is if you die in under 3 seconds, it is your fault. If you die over the course of 6 to 10 seconds, it is your healer's fault. Pay attention to kind of what's going on. If you're somebody who gets chunked fairly hard and you die within 3 seconds, make sure you're using your defensive cooldowns more appropriately. Make sure you're using your standard mitigation to smooth out some of that damage, or make sure you're trying to kite a little bit more to keep some distance between the mobs in the dungeon, give your healer a little bit more time to reach you. Finally, I just want to point out, as far as defensive cooldowns, it is absolutely impossible to take 0 damage. You're always going to be taking damage while you're within these dungeons and while you're within raids. Alright guys, some final tips while we're closing up this video. There's a couple things I wanted to just mention. If you are particularly new to tanking, don't be afraid to go out and give it a shot. Don't be afraid to go out there and pull bigger than maybe you're comfortable doing. Don't be afraid to ask for help. What I find typically is a lot of people are afraid to try tanking, but when you ask them about it, they've never actually done it or tried it before. Give it a shot, give it a go. Know that you will potentially fail at it, but know that if you fail, you can learn from those mistakes, develop and grow and be better. The second thing is continue to communicate with your DPS, with your healers. Even communicate with them afterwards and ask, hey, did I take a lot of damage here? Hey, was my positioning okay here? What did you think? Ask them what they're thinking. A lot of times they have a much better perspective than you, and they can give you some pointers and some tips like, hey, move that a little bit more to the left so I'm not standing in this, or your healer can say, hey, make sure you use a defensive cooldown when you've got this many seconds. I just can't heal through that. If you're running with a consistent group of individuals, that can be extremely helpful for your success in the future. Never forget how important kiting is within the dungeon. Make sure you communicate with your healer, hey, I'm going to be booking it, and then let your DPS know, hey, if you can slow or stun anything, it's going to be extremely helpful for me. That way you can save your defensive cooldown for boss fights if it's tyrannical week, or you can save those defensive cooldowns for later if there's a high intake of damage. If you end up running for a long period of time with individuals, you can communicate external cooldowns for damage reductions with your healer. Most healer classes have some sort of damage reduction that they can place on you that you can call for. You can communicate that ahead of time with pugs if you need to. Otherwise, just make sure that you're communicating those and having those timers set up for instances of high spike damage. Last but certainly not least, the biggest thing that a lot of people are afraid of is that they don't know the routes for a lot of these dungeons. I cannot emphasize this enough. That is not the most important thing that you need to know when you're running these dungeons. You do not need to know the route, you do not need to know where you're going, you need to know how you're going to play, how you're going to position things, and you can figure out where you're going to go by pulling up the map. If you know the dungeon well enough and you've DPS'd it well enough, then you know the route, you know where you're supposed to go. Give it a shot, throw it together, and get out there and see what's going on.